Hey guys, and welcome back to Studio One with me, Gregor. Today we're concluding our video manual series on the dynamic processors, the compressor, the limiter, the gate, and finally today, the expander. Another incredibly useful tool, although it's probably the least known of the four that I just mentioned. But once you see the applications for this and how useful it can be, I'm sure you're gonna use it a lot more in your productions. So let's take a closer look. I've shown you in my compressor video manual, the link is here if you haven't seen that already, how the compressor can be used to reduce dynamic range, meaning it makes the difference between the loud parts and the quiet parts of the signal smaller. And that's achieved by attenuating the high-level part of the signal, meaning the loud parts are being pushed down in volume, while the quieter parts are neither attenuated nor amplified. And the expander does the exact opposite to that. Instead of decreasing the dynamic range of a signal, the expander increases it. So that means that the low-level part of the signal is being attenuated even further, like think bleed or noise on a track that you want to get rid of. It's pretty quiet. That's got to be made even quieter and everything else remains unaffected. So the expander is really a perfect cleanup tool, if you will. But you can also use the expander in many other applications. You can use it almost like a transient designer to shorten the ambience and the decay on the recording that's too busy. I'm going to show you examples for that also. So let's take a look. First things first, how do we find the expander? As always, we go to the effects browser here in Studio One, and when we scroll down, we should find the expander right away here in the native plugin section. And then you just drag and drop that onto any track where you're experiencing a problem, such as noise, crossbleed. The expander can really help a lot with that. So we just drag and drop that onto my snare track in this case, where I can hear quite a bit of bleed coming from the cymbal and hi-hat mics, and it's a bit much for my liking. First of all, let me bypass the expander so you can hear the original track. You should be able to hear quite a bit of the cymbals bleeding through there. And let's take a look at the controls that we find on the expander and how they can help us to, in this case, really just hear the snare drum on this track and not the hi-hats and not the cymbals. Because the expander is so similar in its design to the compressor, the controls are pretty much the same. The main difference is just how these controls behave. So the threshold on the compressor basically sets the point of level at which the compressor starts working. So for example, if it's set to -18, then the compressor starts working as soon as the level is crossing -18 dB. With the expander, it's the opposite. So the expander works up until -18 dB, right? So everything that's below -18 dB is going to be attenuated even further by the expander, and everything that's above the threshold remains untouched. So now that we kind of know what the expander does, we have a simple concept in mind, we can apply that directly using the controls. And here's my favorite way to do this. First of all, I like to set the reduction range all the way down, because this lets me hear the threshold effect. So setting threshold now is much easier because I can clearly hear what it does. And I can already hear that the threshold has to be a bit further up because I can still hear the cymbals and the hi-hats and the stuff that I want to kill. But I also don't want to bring it up too far because then I start to really compromise the original sound of the snare. That's not what I want. I just want to get the crossbleed under control. And once I have a setting that I sort of like, I can now adjust it more finely by using the ratio, which again determines the slope of the gain reduction, and the range, which sets the maximum amount of gain reduction. And of course, we could have also used the gate for this task, which is essentially a more extreme form of the expander. But if you need a bit more gradual control, then the expander often just is a better choice and can be more finely adjusted. This is gonna become clear, especially with the next example. In this example, my goal is to shorten the decay time and the room ambience on a very busy drum loop. Have a listen without the expander. I'm just gonna bypass that for a moment. That's just way too busy, right? At least for my liking. And that's where the expander can really help us, because it can make the decay times between the transient hits, the loud parts, much quieter while keeping the transients intact. So in a way, it's going to work like a transient designer where you're just shortening the decay of everything that you don't want to accentuate. So let's see how that works. We put the expander out of bypass And we're gonna put the threshold all the way down so the expander does nothing so far. And then we can bring the threshold slowly up until we can hear the expander working. And as soon as I feel that the room ambience is now dampened enough, then we can also play with attack and release on the envelope here to shape that result rhythmically. Just enough so that the essence of the rhythm gets accentuated and not lost in the reduction. And if I now A/B compare here with and without the expander, you should hear that it's still the same thing. It's just that the drum loop is now very nicely cleaned up and less busy. Just like with the other dynamic processes, you can also use the expander to control the level of a given track using another track via sidechain. And I really like this function, particularly for creative purposes. You can engage that here by clicking on sidechain and then selecting another channel if that's present. I've already covered that in a different video on creative sidechaining, so definitely check that out if you haven't already. It's going to be linked here in the top corner. So as you can see, there's a ton of applications for the expander. Go ahead and try it out yourself, and thank you for watching.